Melissa.
Hi, Lauren.
Hello, Valerie.
Hi, Valerie.
Hi. Hi, Melissa. Hi, Lauren. How are you?
All right, thank you.
Lauren, I'm getting the door quickly. I'll be back.
Okay.
Okay.
It's just now 5:30. We don't yet have a quorum of the board. As soon as we do, I'll call the meeting to order. All right, it appears that we have a quorum of the board. Good evening, everyone. Today is Monday, April 12th, and I'm going to call to order this work session of the Board of Education. As a reminder to board trustees and any attendees from the public, we will not be conducting regular business of the board this evening. The purpose of this work session is to discuss the draft 2021-2022 school budget. And so I just want to start by providing the background that on March 10th and March 22nd, Dr. Henning Piedmont and Maureen Caraballo presenting to the board draft versions of the school year budget. And then again, we met at our regular board meeting on April 7th, where Maureen and Valerie presented the draft budget to the board. And at the April 7th meeting, it was shared that New York State aid would be increasing. And in addition, the district may be eligible for federal dollars in relation to the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act and the American Rescue Plan. And the increases in state aid at that meeting were estimated to be in the amount of $466,000. Tonight, we expect to hear more about the exact figures related to New York State aid, to how federal dollars may be allocated within the budget, and to hear scenarios which we can discuss to finalize the budget. The board will not be voting on any aspect of the budget tonight, but providing guidance and asking questions to determine the final proposed budget for the 21-22 school year. And on April 20th, at our next board meeting, the board will vote on the proposed budget. On May 4th, the public may share their thoughts on the budget in a public hearing, and on May 18th, there's a village-wide vote for the adoption of the budget. So that's just some background on where we are right now in the budget process and the overview of where we are tonight. Dr. Henning Piedmont and Maureen, if you'd like to go ahead and begin sharing. I know at this point, we haven't seen the new information, so the information being shared out right now is new to trustees as well as any attending the meeting.
Great, thank you so much. Before Maureen starts presenting, she and I both have been in various meetings with our counterparts in other school districts that have talked about how to approach one-time infusion of funding to the district. And and I think Maureen hinted at some of this, the last time we talked about this, or at least shared with you what we understood from the new state aid runs. Districts are approaching it, from the standpoint of, how to support the taxpayers, whether it be to use it as, to reduce, debt, use it to reduce, the levy, use it for some short-term infrastructure related projects, as well as for to support instruction in some way. So those are the things that are happening across, school districts as they think about how to make use of these funds. And then what Maureen will share with you, obviously, is sort of what what we've looked at in terms of what what you've asked us to review around some of the proposed additions to the 2021-2022 school budget. And of course, Maureen will have some thoughts about, as I said, what would make sense from the standpoint of those ideas that, as I said, my colleagues are discussing as well as hers with regards to decisions around the use of those funds. So thank you very much again, Maureen.
Yes, so tonight I'm going to share my screen shortly. I just was working on it today to come up with a new proposed budget based on our last meeting and some of the feedback that we received from the board. And again, as Lauren had mentioned, this does not reflect, there's still time in which to weigh in, and if there needs to be other changes or other ideas that other things you would like addressed in the budget. But just tonight to kind of catch us up on where we are this evening. As Lauren had mentioned, the last meeting, we found out our state aid just 12 hours or so prior to the time of last meeting, our updated state number, which now reflects an increase over what we were always projecting an increase, but we then found out that that increase was even more than we had initially factored into our budget proposal. So what I will share with you this evening is where our budgets, our spending plan currently stands. It reflects the update of the revenue that we discussed in terms of the state aid. As Valerie spoke about, and we'll get into it when we speak about the budget, the new federal dollars, so the state aid number is a revenue number in which we know will be coming the traditional route, for lack of better words, meaning that'll come through in our funding. But there are other dollars that we started to discuss last week in terms of the 2 new appropriated amounts from the federal government. Those amounts will not run through the, they're going to be handled as other federal monies are, which will be budgeted for not in the general fund budget. So we still have time to present how we believe those dollars should be spent based upon the requirements around how those dollars can be spent. So this evening, we're really going to focus on the budget that would need to be voted on by voters and where our current plan stands. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share it now. And where is my presentation? Let me go here. Okay. Oops. Oh, that's not the right one. Sorry. I just noticed that's the last one. I'm sorry. Let me just reshare my screen. I had just pulled that up to print it out to see where that last one was. No, that's not what I want either. Just bear with me. Sorry. I had it up and then I switched screens earlier. Why can I not? Oh, my goodness. Why is this not? I want to escape out of this one. Stop share. Why is that? Just give me 1 second. Oh, great. All right. Okay. Too many screens open right now. Okay. Let me get rid of this. Okay. Back to here. So 3 times the charm here. Okay. All right, we all see this one, right? With today's date on it. Okay. Not even 3rd time's a charm, probably like 5 times is a charm. Okay, so tonight again, this is another draft of where our current budget stands based upon our new state aid numbers and feedback. And again, as we get closer, as I mentioned, to adopting a final budget, there's different information that we do receive at different times that will either reduce some of the proposals, add to, and what we're presenting tonight is actually a reduction, some of which we spoke about the last meeting in terms of after having many of the meetings, the special education department felt comfortable withdrawing some of their proposed additional aids. And then some of the other adjustments to the spending tonight reflect some feedback we received from the board. So this is where our budget overview stands this evening. And really the total amount of the budget primarily is changed by removing, other than the restoration of the science position, other positions that we've been speaking about, the potential need of an additional section of kindergarten, an expansion of some existing roles, the math interventionist at Hillside and the diversity coordinator district-wide. Currently, they're not reflected in this budget. The only new additional position that's reflected in this budget overview is the restoration of that science position. We've gone through and we have restored some of those co-curricular items at previous board meetings, but this is where our current budget reflects what our current budget proposal overview dollar-wise reflects. And we can talk more about the details. This now, our current budget is the proposed budget is increasing by 2.25%. If you may recall, I think at a few weeks ago, I think we were at like 3.57 or 3.56. So we've tried to get that down. There was some tightening up of some software. Melissa worked with the some of the different software titles. She tightened that up, and there were some other tweaks and tightening of some of the line by line budget items that helped us to get this number to where you see this evening. Again, the state aid, I was able to kind of tweak and finalize that number. I think last week it was, this is only maybe 20,000 more than I showed last week, but as I've been able to kind of get some more details on some of those expense-driven aids, we're anticipating our state aid next year, outside of those federal monies, to be coming at $5.7 million. That's a year-over-year budget increase, although not a year-over-year actual increase of about 1.2 million. Again, we've spoken about at other meetings, and I have another more breakdown of that miscellaneous receipts just to see what we anticipate dollars getting in that particular line. This particular budget, I know we did discuss the concern about the use of the appropriated fund balance, and it was important, at least that was the directive I felt we were given the last time, to look at ways to reduce that appropriated balance, because understanding that at one point or another that could get tricky in terms of a revenue source dropping off. So we look to kind of pull that back as far as we could, and keeping kind of without needing to reduce anything further. And right now we're looking at that appropriated balance to be at 700,000, which is almost $1 million less than we appropriated for this current budget. The retirement reserve and the tax certiorari reserve recommendation is remaining the same as it has been, I think, since we began presenting this budget. And that our current property tax needed to balance this budget would be $533,000, which, as you can see, is a change to the levy of 1.22%. And it brings the effective tax rate year over year to an estimated 1.08% increase. Now, this current budget overview reflects not levying the entire tax cap, and I will show you on the next slide how much below the tax cap we currently are. Again, just as a reminder, the only new position in this budget currently is this restoration of the science position. These are just some other items. Again, these are not reflected in the budget, but again, I kept this slide in there just as a reminder of things, some other things that potentially could occur after we finalize this budget, which is always the case with any budget, quite frankly. I mean, there's a point in which you have to move it forward. So there's always going to be some of these future variables, but just as a reminder for anyone that may be watching, the final state allocation, where we are comfortable, of course, with what we presented on the previous slide. I had mentioned that those federal monies, we will have to work together to develop a plan on how we're going to spend those. I had mentioned last week that those funds are actually running over multiple school years. So as Valerie said, there's a lot of talk in the region on how those monies will be used. There are some requirements around using some of those funds for learning loss and things such as that, but we'll be able to present that separately, as it does not need to be voted on. And also, as Valerie had mentioned, some districts are looking at either doing kind of one-off cost type things, or infrastructure projects and things that are allowable under the federal guidelines. But again, we need some more time to unpack that so we can be really targeted and deliberate with how we decide to spend those funds. But these are, again, I don't need to read through the entire list, but just some items that, again, this is why budgets do change from when we first present to when it's finally adopted, and then it could change yet again before the school year begins. In either additions or subtractions, you could have a child new to the district, but you could also have children exit the district. So that's why sometimes the reconciliation of your proposed budget to actuals does change. I was asked to look at our current proposed 21-22 budget and identify some items that may not be recurring costs in the 22-23 school year. Although some of them, I have a question mark against some. I mean, obviously just going through and kind of chunking some of the larger type items, litigation. And the reason I wrote this is, currently the last few years, we have a couple things we're involved in with litigation, but there has been a time in which the amount we spend in that area has been significantly less. So next year we are still budgeting for our last few years of experience in terms of that expense, but that is an area that, you know, it does go in ebbs and flows, and that would be an example of something that over the next couple of years, and just kind of looking at that, it's not a guarantee, but that is an item that right now is not always going to be the same level of recurring costs. And again, of course, you'll always have some, but this would reflect, you know, if the trend were to be, we start, you know, there will be some drop off of that in the next few years, I hope. BOCES environmental testing, we did have some testing just of some work that we're doing around the building. And again, that would be a non-recurring cost. And that has to do with some of the slated work for the summer that Joe's team would do. So again, we would do it this year, and then we would not have that cost in the following budget cycle. Equipment, furniture, we are looking to purchase some items in this upcoming budget that would not be necessary in the following year. This year, there's a proposal for new math textbooks and also some PD around that implementation. So that's why, I don't know if you recall, but in the budget detail, there was a higher budget over budget amount. And again, that's not something that would happen in the following year. So that is more or less a one-time expenditure for next year. Again, settlements, those are items that, although we would always have a certain amount of them, but that could be something right now, and looking out in the out years, looks like something that would potentially drop off in the 22-23 budget cycle. And then we do have a small amount of COVID nursing staff if there was a need still for like any type of surveillance testing, that we would hope that that would go away eventually. So that is just some items that we can kind of look at and say, okay, they would then drop off in the following out years. This is just an update as a reminder of our revenue overview. I put it in here because we have tweaked these numbers along the way, and this is just gives us a little bit further of a breakdown, or gives, for those who are watching, a little bit more of a breakdown of what we're projecting different revenue sources to be for next year. And as you can see, again, the largest change that we've been focusing on the last few meetings is both the amount of state aid we're receiving and the amount of money that we're recommending to be funded from fund balance and reserves. All the other numbers more or less have tweaked a bit, but have been fairly consistent since the beginning of our budget season. So, but those two items are the ones that have changed the most in the last week or so. Here again, this is a tax cap updated sheet, and again, it reflects the overview amount that we've showed you earlier in this meeting. And in previous budget presentations, we were actually recommending on those at those other meetings that we were up to the max levy cap. And this currently reflects, with the increase of state aid and the decrease of some expenses, that in this particular budget overview I've showed you this evening, we would actually be 165,000 under the max cap. And I'm sure we can discuss that more when we get into when the board asks some questions, because we have spoken a lot about strategy in that, and there is some, most people don't like to leave any levy on the table, but again, just when I work the numbers, this is what, you know, was left on the table. And if we were thinking to go to the max levy and we didn't want to add anything back in terms of expenditures, this would either be an opportunity to also reduce the amount of appropriated fund balance, and that would work to get us back to the max levy. I was asked to present, or, you know, this is like, again, this has changed since the beginning when we look at this multiple times during the year, because it does change based upon, you know, our revenue and expenditures over the course of a fiscal year, and that changes based upon what's actually going on in the district. So, you know, currently, again, this reflects also the one of the big factors that is impacting both our projected end of year is the amount of state aid we actually received this year, which up until recently, you know, up throughout until really after January, did we really have a good understanding that we were going to receive more state aid, because as the federal money was flowing into the state, they were able to restore or not reduce what they initially had talked about reducing for this fiscal year. And then we also know we have more income coming next year. So because those two factors, as well as just our spending and other revenues and seeing more sales tax, impact where we see ourselves at the end of this school year. And this chart here for fund balance and reserves reflects what our estimated June 2021, and it is tied to our new proposed budget, meaning this reflects the pullback or the reduction of use of appropriated fund balance. It reflects then by not using that money then can go back to a reserve, right? So if we were appropriating next year, then it doesn't become available to put into a reserve account. So what that really means overall is where we anticipate seeing the year in terms of our total fund balance, we're seeing a slight reduction over what our June 30th, 2020 amount was. And then in the out years, we do see that without, again, each year is different, and each year the amount of money left over at the end of the year and how much money you'll be able to appropriate back to fund balance decreases, right? So if we're continuously using monies out of reserves and unable to put any money back, that's where you're seeing, in the estimated June 2022, right now, as of today, with the limited information we know about what will happen next year, we are projecting that if we use some of that fund balance and are not able to full restore at the same level we are this year, then you see that kind of decrease over the next few years of fund balance. And again, that's why it's important always to look at this and update it based upon as the information, as you're in each school year, these things do change. So but I was asked to provide an update to the board on that. So as you see, we're projecting to end the year very similar in terms of total fund balance. The breakdown of what we're doing is different, but the total amount is in around similar to last year's. And, I wanted to get more into this discussion, maybe when I don't know how the board wants to handle this, but this is an update again, and this is tied really to the reserves, because there's always a concern about sustainability, and these are always we're required to kind of always have a 5-year projection as we're thinking about our budgets. But this is really, now that we know what our estimated budget proposal is for next year, I was able to project out some out years now, because obviously we've changed the proposed budget a few times, and now we do have a different spending plan for next year, and that is broken out here. But I think when we do think about each year, you have to think about what is then that impact for next year. But one thing just to consider when I do these projections, this is based on the workforce that's here today, right? It doesn't account for either and the children and all the things that we're using today, and it kind of more or less just sort of pushes out those expenses. The reason why sometimes people say, well, you projected this and then the budget's this, is because things change. Children come, they go, needs change, staff changes, sometimes what you think you need some less of. So, again, it is a way to look at it and really think about how budget growth happens. It is an important conversation to have. But we do have to understand that, this is also projecting on our current staffing. People retire. There are some, changes that happen year over year. But just to get a sense, of course, when you're talking about a $52 million budget, if the staff were not to change, if everything was more or less to stay the same for 22, 23, you'll see how the budget, if you have the same more or less growth year over year, and this also reflects the new debt that would come on with our new bond, right? So we also know that that's going to be coming on at 22, 23, and 23, 24. It is important when you're looking at it, because that there will be an impact to the tax rate in the 22, 23, and 23, 24 for that new debt, and also just the natural growth of a budget if there isn't any savings. But typically that you do get some breaks in some of your expenses, but just it is a good exercise to do. It's a good thing to think about, because the budget does tend to go only up, not really down. Right? So right now, again, this reflects the 2.25%, our current budget suggestion is for next year, but you can see that if nothing were to change, you're looking and on the low end at a 3.3 year over year increase in the following year, because again, the part of that is driven by the debt coming on the books in the 22-23 school year, as well as just, even if expenditure is only growing by 2%, and it does, the amount that's needed in the following year is fairly significant on a $52 million budget. So again, it's just something to consider for conversation. And just as we talk about the sustainability, I know there's concern always around sustainability of a budget, of our budget. And again, similar on the revenue side of things. Again, these are projections, but again, you can see where, and this reflects kind of that idea that if we start pulling ourselves off of the reliance on fund balance, how you could have some revenue shortages if some of those other revenues don't restore. But we are projecting, the legislation is projecting that the state aid, according to them, is going to be restored over the next few, that they're going to continue to fund foundation aid. The one tricky part is if the state doesn't have the infusion of federal money next year, will they really be able to do it? So I think that was a concern that we discussed as a group. So if in fact in 22-23 school year, if the state's able to continue to fund us at the same level as they were able to for the 21-22 school year, although it's showing a little bit of a deficit here in the model, those are things that either can be, that we may have some expenditure savings, or some of the other revenues may come in a little bit higher. So it's not insurmountable. But I think the one thing that we're being really cautious about is until we actually see the state's ability to make sure they can make the commitment to all schools, because in fairness to them, the state has lost a lot of money, and although the federal government, as they've done in many states, is giving money to states, will they be able to, fund those type of dollars in the out years? And I think that's the piece that we do have to kind of be, just keep in mind. I think we just have to be cautious in thinking about the future year's budgets. But I mean, it's not necessarily this year. We kind of had to go with what we know for this year, which we provided for you. But just thinking about those out years, we hope that the state is able to fund us in what they're saying. But I think that's going to be something we'll have to see what happens in those out years. So that's why those federal monies that come in, we have to be deliberate. We have to be careful in how we're using them. And as Valerie said, if there's an opportunity, either which we tried to do this year by, putting money or reappropriating money back to reserves and not adding to expenses other than the restoration of science, because that'll, with the amount of fund balance I showed you on the earlier slide, that'll help us if in fact there's a little bit of a drop off next year. Then we can at least at that point have a little bit of flexibility if we have to appropriate, although we don't want to do that, but at least then we're not using all the money this year to balance our budget. So that kind of pulling back a fund balance for next year's budget is actually going to help us in those out years, because now we're kind of holding on to a couple more dollars. And I think that's going to be important as the state, is going to have to, rebound a bit. I think we all know that. So that's really it. I mean, I have the other presentations. I could pivot and pull up other things if you want to, but I really wanted to kind of show where we now are since the last time we met, and where that puts our overall budget. So I don't know if you want to if anyone has any questions, or we can go back on anything that I presented, anything from previous presentations, any thoughts you may have on what was presented this evening.
Well, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Maureen. You can go ahead, Doug. I was just going to say that, this time last year we were pivoting in a different direction. So, the your nimble skills, Maureen, are much appreciated in giving us, this new phase of state aid, as opposed to the phase of state aid of withdrawing that we were in last year. So I know that personally, I want to talk about this, $165,000 under the cap and what that plays out to be. But Doug, I know you had questions, so why don't you go ahead first?
I probably a few, but just wanted to kick off. So I see the instructional line item came down from 33,040 to 32,853. What was the additional decrease there? That was,
Well, the majority of it was driven by not adding those positions into the budget. Other than the science, last time we still had the expansion of the other roles. We had an additional kindergarten teacher, and again, some of it
that was in there last time. Got it.
correct, and those are now. This reflects the update, and the only thing that is additional this year over what was last year, really, in terms of positions, was the restoration of that science. So
Right.
this is an update to that. And again, we did make some also tweaks. Melissa made some tweaks to instructional software code. We tightened up where we could. We went back and just went back over like supply lines, and there was like some other small tweaks, but that's the primary driver of that change.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm sure you said this. The reserve and fund balance slide.
Yep.
Was that including the new monies from the state?
Yes.
It did. Okay.
Yeah, no, but it doesn't include those federal dollars that I spoke about last week,
Okay.
because those will not be there. They won't be accounted for. They're required to be accounted for in the federal fund budget. And the good news, though, is that it's good because we have time now to really understand and make a plan to use those funds over those. I mentioned there's some of them are like through 24, some are through 23, but those are not reflected in the reserve. But that could long-term help us, either maintain some of our reserves if we're able to use those monies. That may ultimately help us in that way, but currently those are not reflected in what I presented tonight. Those other federal monies, but the new state aid dollar amount and what we're receiving this year is reflected in those projections.
Maureen, could you talk about, just go over the diversity position that this cuts out and what that would mean?
Well, I think it's not that. I think what we tried to do in just pulling back some of the positions was that we had the restoration of the science, which really was the only thing that was really a restoration rather than an addition. So I think part of the thinking was not, with that position, what that would have meant is I think we would have either had to, there was a part-time E&L teacher that would have had to, in order to cover that, would have been expanded. But I think part of the rationale to kind of not so much as not do it, but just hold for this year was to kind of get a better understanding of like where the state's really going to end up. So we really didn't add any of the new positions, but right now it wasn't necessarily like anything that was, I guess, put in there was more like, well, let's see, either is there any money we could use in the federal grants? We don't know. Like, is there going to be an ability even in some of those other monies to either pay for some of these things, but we really have to unpack that. But in order to get this budget, sort of where we felt it was and make sure we could sustain it, we were like, let's just only restore that position. Everything else is kind of either on hold, or if there's another opportunity somewhere down the road with some other, like if there was some other money pot that came out of it, like sometimes some of those things, I'm just thinking like the remediation or something, maybe something that we could potentially pay out of a grant. But right now we weren't expanding the role, Jody, so it's at a 0.6 now, and it would remain there for next year.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I just gave it long, but it was kind of like, we looked at it more like a pause, because where there's this uncertainty in those out years. I think if there was certainty, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think if we had some certainty that those state aid dollars would be there recurring, I think we could look at different things differently. I think there's a real fear on like what's going to happen those out years, and we certainly don't want to do anything that will be like, oh, now we have to reduce this or that, or in the following. So I think the science really felt like a restoration, and everything else was even with the so I know
Thank you.
I keep repeating myself, but okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can you just remind me if there were any other positions that we that we cut that were on the table to restore this year? I know the science was one, but weren't there some other positions that?
Yeah, well, last year there was, I mean, we had the FLES at Hillside that we ended up, I guess we got rid of, we no longer offer FLES at Hillside. And there was, I believe, there was some world language in the middle school, a reduction. There is still some level of offering. I think it's in the wheel if I'm correct, but there was a position that we didn't fill last year. So similar to science. I think the way the science shook out, it was more impactful on time in terms of like some of the offerings at the high school, if I, can recall, in their ability to cover some of it. But I do believe that the world language is, I mean, Melissa or Valerie could probably speak to, I think it's, it scaled back, I think, some of the offerings at maybe 5th grade.
Yeah.
So that was one, but that one, Jeremy, when the budget proposals come from the building level, that the science was the only one in terms of the restoration that really came, and it came at both sort of the middle school and high school, both together, sort of proposed it, I would say. So we kind of also went off of what was being requested from the budget manager. So that was the only, of course, we restored some of the funding to the theater and things such as that as well. And again, that came directly from our building level leaders. So that's what kind of ended up there.
Yes, I was going to mention that the middle school theater program had been reduced in this current school year, and this budget reflects a restoration of that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think because it was a fairly, I mean, it's kind of in those lines where we didn't look at his position, but we did restore that funding early on in our budget presentations right to the line. But in terms of the positions, that's the only one at this point that was included.
In terms of the kindergarten position or the Hillside numbers, I know that we were going to get some further information. I don't know if Melissa Szymanski, you could speak about that position, because as it stands now, this proposed draft budget doesn't offer an additional position at Hillside. And I just want to, the data we were looking at, I think, was from January, and I just want to make sure that we're not making a decision that's too short-sighted.
Sure, I can speak to that, and it hasn't changed since the last time we met. Our projections are much higher than our actuals, so we're doing our best to reconcile. It's always very hard with kindergarten, but I'm just trying to take a peek here. So the last time we were looking at the numbers, they were, more than half, but what ends up happening is that we can't guarantee, I mean, kindergarten's always a bit of a wild card. What we're seeing in terms of the trend right now, in terms of the registration, it doesn't lead us to predict that we'll need an additional section there. Even taking into account past years pre-COVID, this is a little bit more difficult. Because I think families are still making various decisions based on the conditions of the pandemic too, which is completely understandable. But right now, in terms of hard numbers and based on trends of what we're seeing in the past, we're not seeing that there's a need for an additional section there at the moment.
Thanks, Melissa.
Maureen, could you go back to the slide where it showed our reserves predicted out 2 or 3 years?
Yep. This one?
Thank you. That one, yep. What's the main driver taking us from a 9 million? Seems like we've had 9 million fund balance 4 years in a row, and now we're predicting to go down 3 million, to go down below 6 million.
Yeah.
Is that because we're not counting on the federal money that you think might be coming, or are we just still generally spending $1 million more per year than we're even in a year where we're getting $1 million more from the state than we were expecting? It seems like we're going down $1 million a year. Am I misreading something?
No, I mean, of course, we're getting more money from the state, but then on the flip side of it, remember, we've been spending so much more in the COVID that we ever anticipated. So I think that probably sort of, thankfully kind of evened it out. Like, because I think initially the projections for the end of year fund balance this year have gotten better, I guess is the word, because of that, those dollars coming in. But in those out years, Jeremy, like I said, I think the part when you're looking at the out years is you can kind of conservatively, say, well, hopefully we'll have some budget savings or we'll see things. But what I'm trying to project out is that if we were to continue, the idea here is that we would continue to use some amount to of the retirement reserves. The tax cert part of the reduction there is really, there are some tax certs will be settling, and that would be normal to see some decrease there, because that, it's set up in order to pay like out obligations. So some of that spending down of 400,000 and just say in that particular line would be appropriate, and we may not need to reserve any more monies there. But in general, if we get tighter or our revenues get tighter year over year, the amount you're able to add back, and if you're using it, then you have like less to add back, so like that's the other piece. So, and part of it I think is tied to what I showed on the other slides, is where if we're anticipating, and again, there's things that can change in that, because again, that's just looking at a snapshot of today and just blowing it out with the same staff. If we continue to have those type of increases, and we do still need to use some of that fund balance, we're not going to be able to restore it. So it's kind of also tied to those budget projections. Does that make sense? I know it's a little convoluted, but it's
No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm trying to sense if that's something that we should keep our eye on.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
we have to, yes, we have to.
How many years? I mean, is 9 million pretty much where you felt comfortable in your 20 plus years here?
Yes.
Obviously, it's growing as a percentage. It seems that as our budget is growing, it's even worse than just a drop of 33%. Having 10 million when you're below $50 million, and 3 years out, we're expecting probably to be at 56 million. We're getting close. Are these percentages concerning?
Yes. Well, the thing is, there's two things. Fund balance is important for, variety, obviously, and I've said this, and I think it's always a good conversation of what is the right amount. So I think somewhere in the $10 million range on a 50 something million dollar budget, in my opinion, is the right amount. And there's reasons I think that. It's because it's actually cash flow for us. We don't receive our first, when we're entering our next budget our next fiscal year, we don't get our first cash infusion till October. We start our fiscal year in July. So our fund balance actually cash flows us to payrolls, health insurance, obligations, that we have to pay. So without that, you have to borrow money to pay your bills, which is not a good thing, because it's interest that the district then has to pay and becomes part of your general fund budget. So for us, we always need a minimal of about $6 or $7 million, more or less, just to pay our bills until we get our money in October. So that's always an important thing in terms of just being able to sustain yourself. And then of course you have obligations. So I would say that for us, like, I always like it to be around 10 million, quite frankly, but I think this is, I don't know what the out years are going to look like, but if I'm assuming.
No, that's exactly where I'm thinking, like, if the plan was to
million,
always try to get it. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I'm interrupting you. I'm looking. The only one area occasionally, if we don't have a lot of obligations in tax cert, I'm more comfortable with that amount going down, because that's based upon, I think with the reevaluation, we're seeing a little bit less in the tax certiorari. So, somewhere in the $9 to $10 million range, you want to say 8, 9, we definitely don't, that 7 and 6 million, I don't love. And again, I'm just not knowing what's going to happen, but it is important to, think about not really wanting to drop really much below like 8 million.
And yet we are dropping below 8 million. So if this was like a priority, we would be trying to trim another 1% out of the budget every year. That would only be 500,000.
Right.
We'd be trying to trim another 2%, $1 million per year out of the budget. Is there a category that you think we should be focusing on to prior budgets clearly plan to replenish the funds as we grabbed from them. And it seems right now we're caught in a mini spiral where we're not replenishing reserves and we're, luckily getting state aid. But when does this ever change? How do we go from 6 million back up to 8 million if in actuality we're spending $1 million more than we have? We're not replenishing, we're going in the other direction. Is there a couple categories that you could direct us to look at?
Well, in terms of, I think there's always the things. Obviously, if you look at it just from the program side, of course, there's always class sizes. That's an area which, if you're talking about overall spending, we've talked a lot about transportation, and it is an area that, I have to say that the consortium, the Quad Village, and now we've actually expanded it to 2 other districts. We have really made a lot of headway in savings there. There's a couple ideas you could look to. I know it would be very unpopular. Not only limit the out of district, which again has to be done somewhat in conjunction with our neighbors, or else we have to pull out of the consortium, because again, they're as of right now, they don't seem to be keen on some of those changes. But I do think, we continue to try to find budget savings there, and you can kind of see it where, over the years, even, our actuals last year because of the pandemic were less, but, typically like a few years ago, we were almost spending 1.6 million in that, and we have trimmed it down by extending our bus routes. But one of the things you consider is, I know this would be tough, but not offering in-district busing. Some districts have looked at that. Pleasantville, similar size, they don't offer it. That would save us like $350,000, because we get transportation aid on our out of district runs. In district, we're above the state requirement, right? It's 2 miles, anything above 2 miles, we would have to transport. I think we might have 20 something kids eligible for it, and we would run one small van or something. So again,
I like the thought of transportation, and and I broached that very unpopular subject before of larger class sizes.
right.
And it's not because anybody wants their kid to be one of 26 if out of 21 was possible.
Right.
But is there a way where we can stop bringing in outside consultants while we're spending over? How much do we spend on what I would call, teacher professional development? Is that something we can throw completely in-house? Principals, APs, and admins have to run the days.
Right.
How much, because if I'm really just concerned, it just looks like we're spending more than we take in.
Right.
And we're so lucky that this funding formula that has been horribly unfair to New York City is coming our way as well. And it's really surprising that we're going to 6 million fund balance when we're watching our fund formula finally get the respect of our community deserves. Like, how much do we spend, in a professional development line? Maybe Melissa, maybe Maureen. If we threw it all on administrators to run those days, we have department heads, we have grade meetings. Are we spending, is that an option as opposed to just pulling the very unpopular items?
I guess, Melissa, you can speak.
Sure, I'll speak to that. So first, in terms of the actual budgetary number for that is not what I see as like a significant dent if you're looking at long-term sustainability. I think the question you're raising is around, who's facilitating what and what's the purpose. And I would argue that from a place of some of these outside consultants who are very steeped in their field and really steeped in it's specifically, it's hard for any one person to be an expert on everything. But when you're thinking about, the most current research and the latest trends, when someone's working internationally in that, I'm thinking about, I'm looking at Dr. Deidre Price Dennis, for example. So the work has been incredibly valuable. And I think when you take a look at the budget line item and the level of expertise in a particular area, that's very important. I think what you're also talking about is that we have a lot of really talented, dedicated educational professionals who have a lot to offer. And that's more of that distributed leadership piece around, where are there opportunities for people to bring their level of expertise to do the in-house facilitation? And I think it's a very good and important question. But when you're thinking from a budgetary perspective, that's not something that you're looking at long-term sustainable, ongoing savings. When I'm thinking about the actuals, and then what the payoff is in terms of the learning experiences based on expertise of certain individuals.
Melissa, thank you for phrasing it that way, because I tend to be blunt and not throw the roses around when they're supposed to be right. There, I mean, professional development has huge benefits when teachers need growth and departments grow from outside experts as well. It was more of just looking if we viewed, and I'm using someone else's line on our, from our board here, but if we viewed this growth as unsustainable or not sustainable, it would be this tough trade-off. So if we're not heading towards smaller reserves and higher, a tax cap busting here or there would be, what lines are we willing to bring in-house, even though we are not going to be as good as expert, here or there, and there is some growth. Are there any lines of significance that would make us feel that this is sustainable? Because I don't see how you put up a beautiful, well, maybe I'm trying to put too much gloss on it, but this is a very helpful chart, 3 years back, 3 years forward, and 10 million to 6 million. I mean, that says unsustainable to me.
Well, can I ask a question though here? Maureen, 18, 19, 20, we have almost no change in the reserves. Can you help explain that?
Well, I mean, we had different breaks in different years. So it was either that we were getting unanticipated revenue, some savings and expenses. So, I mean, we have to really break down in each year. I think what ends up happening, I mean, obviously over the course of time, I mean, reserves, moving forward, I mean, right now we have a lower tax cap, right? So the amount you're generating, we had the ability to also levy some higher levies in some of those years also, which did help. We went to the max tax cap, gave us a little bit of a buffer. And as I said, each year is different. And again, I'm doing it, this is a conservative outlook.
That's what I'm trying to get a sense of, Maureen, like
But
what's baked into that 588,
Well, what's baked into it, and we can look at the chart. And again, this is, as I had mentioned, I'm looking at it today, like nobody's going to retire in the next 2 years. Like I took exactly who's working today, exactly the children we're transporting out today, maybe some non-recurring expenses, not a tremendous amount, but some that are baked into those numbers, and then just blowing them out on a percentage, right? It's that it doesn't have the fine tuning when I'm looking at our expenses. And then I'm also not assuming great jumps or new revenues or any other break that may come in. And just as far as the reserves, I'm assuming that we're going to use some to pay down tax certs, because that does in fact happen. And then I'm also assuming we're going to use some capital monies. We're going to pay down, I have a liability reserve that is really set up for liabilities we owe. So once you pay those obligations, like I'm assuming that we won't be refunding that. But the thing is, if right now we go out next year, even if we decide to levy to the max, it is a much lower levy you're starting with than you are, although expenses just grow. We know that the last few years are the TRS and ERS are going up. So the amount of monies left over year over year are just going to be less in the out years based upon a lower tax levy, trying to budget closer, right? We're budgeting, trying to get a little closer to what our actuals are. It is hard, but I mean, it is important to look at it, because in 1 year, and we've talked about this, we've been fortunate, and I know probably people will accuse us of being ultra conservative, but each year I can tell you that, like sometimes you get breaks, sometimes you don't. it's just a matter of, it's a people-centric business. I've seen budgets go both. I've been here long enough to see budgets actually go in the other direction too. I've been here long enough when we didn't barely have any fund balance, and then we were able to build it up over the course of 10 years. So, but there are times that you're not going to be able to restore it. And I think, the good thing about this budget we're looking at today, and thank you to the board for kind of pushing on us even to kind of think about this, is we are reducing the amount of fund balance. That's a good thing. That's actually positioning us better for next year because we are pulling that back, holding on to some of it. We've talked a lot about, there is a point that tax cap is difficult to live under. And I think that's really what we're trying to reflect here. This is also trying to reflect more or less thinking if we were to stay in some type of tax cap model, we're going to have to eat into reserves to balance budgets. I mean, that's just the thing. I don't know, without really piercing the cap, after a while, if we can only levy 1.5% on our tax levy, there's a point in which we'll have to use reserves to balance budgets more so. I mean, so that's also reflected somewhat in the thinking here, and just the fact that if expenses continue to grow, there is a point in which, like, you're not able to add back to reserves also. So I think it's part of it is just living under a restrictive tax cap. We did have some decent growth, and I think 2018 and 19 we had the local growth, which helped us levy more. So in those years we were able to put some money back to the tax cap. But it's something each district looks at each year, and each year is always thinking about the out years. Sometimes we do a little bit better, but I think it is important to consider this. I think even though I hope that those numbers are better when we look at them again next year, but as of right now, we have to consider, that if we continue to use fund balance, there will be a time in which we, it'll start to go down. I think that's what I'm trying to demonstrate here, and also demonstrate some of those liabilities will be addressed. We need to think about that. That being said, I also don't necessarily think, it may be not so much that we cut the budget, but do we consider ever doing, I'm not saying next year, but, consider doing piercing the tax cap possibly. That's also something that you may want to consider. Other districts have, I know it's not popular either, or maybe a combination of both. Do we look to reduce expenses such as transportation? Do we tighten up maybe some of the PD? And I'm just using, some examples that were brought up tonight, or find ways to, become a little bit trimmer and a little bit leaner, coupled with considering, exceeding the tax cap in an out year. That's also a possibility. I think, all of them are in play, but I think that a lot of districts staying under the tax cap is difficult. And that's when you look at the out years and you look at the reserve funding, that's also part of why you're seeing that decrease there.
Right. I think so. It seems like 18, 19, 20, the big driver being able to keep that essentially flat as a reserve. We were spending reserves, but we were replenishing because of the growth factor primarily.
Right.
Yeah.
That, and again, each year, I mean, we can go back over the audit statements, and I know when we're doing it, there's a number of factors, and as much as I know, like when we talk about the salaries, I can tell you that many times it's because I'm assuming certain staff's going to be here, or we either sometimes project we're going to need another section, we don't need it, or we need some aides, we don't need them, or there's a variety of things that happen each year, right? There's busing is that we sometimes have one child that doesn't need a bus, and it says that one child could, I mean, just using that as an example, I sometimes have one child not going to school, it's $100,000 on one child we can save. I mean, it's significant. So each year is different. So it's a combination of, we were able to levy more to the growth. Those years we may have fared better in just our budget overall. We may have had some breaks. I can tell you in some of those years, not as an example, I don't know if you recall this. Remember, we budgeted for an assistant superintendent of curriculum instruction. We didn't hire for one for 2 years, and that was in the budget. So that saved us $300,000 with salary. So that's just examples of like, oh, what happened in 2018? Well, we didn't hire a position we budgeted for it. Like, that's just one example. That's where you get fund balance. That's how you're able to restore fund balance. You budget for something and you don't need it, or you budget for revenues and I think last year, or it was either not last year, previous to that, the county increased their sales tax rate, which was established after we established our budget. So we ended up with more revenue. So there's a lot of different things that occur that generate fund balance, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. If those things don't happen, you can't replenish. So you do have to be mindful of that, and we always look at it. We always try to be conservative in our out years, because I think that's the right thing to do, right? We want to be more conservative with what we think we'll be able to replace, because I don't want to like promise, oh, we'll replace it, and then it doesn't happen. That's a lot worse. But I'm hoping, like, as I keep saying, maybe if there's some people retired, maybe these numbers look a little bit better. But we're certainly not able, we're not going to be able to really probably increase it. I would like to maintain somewhere in the $8 million range, I think is the right number for us, 8 to 9. I mean, I would like more, but I think 8 million is what we kind of need to kind of, but have enough money for our obligations, make sure that we have monies on hand, like I had mentioned, just for cash flow purposes. I think it's always important you have financial obligations that we're aware of. We should make sure we have reserves for those always.
Maureen, can you just help me understand? We're estimated end of 2021, we're at 8,984,291. You've estimated a little over a year from now, it's 7 million. That's almost a $2 million swing. I'm seeing in this budget 750 being used in reserves. How are we getting to 2 million?
Okay, so let me, on which one are you looking at? So let's just look at the way fund balance is broken down, and this is part of it. They look at it on the balance sheet at 6/30/2021, right? But 7/1, if you are in the assigned fund balance, is just like, I'm taking this money, I'm using it as a revenue for next year. If you're unable to replenish that money goes away. Like, you use it, if you're unable to get that savings in next year's budget, there is no 1.4 million. So that's assigned, that's like cash, and it gets added into the 6/30 fund balance sheet, but then effective really 7/1, it's like a revenue, and that sort of disappears if you're unable to replenish it. So the big, change there is the assumption that we're not going to have the budget surplus at the end of 2022 that we had this year, right? So that's one of the large drivers there of the money. And then we're also assuming, if we don't have, like right now, we're revenues over expenditures at year end, we're approximating, like, I'm trying to think what the number is. It's about, like, to say, like 1.8 million or so, right? And the majority of that is being driven by an increase in revenues, right? Unanticipated revenues. Now, obviously, we had those extra revenues this year. Next year, we're budgeting to take and balancing our budget, assuming we're going to get all the state aid. This year, we had the opposite. We balanced our budget with a very low state aid number. We got more state aid. So that's, an example of a large amount of money. Had that money not come through, that 6/30/2020 would look very different, right? It would be like 8 million. If we didn't get those revenues.
So is a lot of this drop, I mean, it looks like a 2 million drop.
Right.
We're at 9 million, we're going to 7 million.
Yep.
A lot of it sounds like we're coming with a trimmer. Like every other year, we over budgeted by $1.5 million, and then we quickly could roll it over or replenish funds. And then immediately a month later, we just re-budgeted for that extra $1.5 million. Is this just the 1 year effect of finally using that extra money that was always just floating around at the end of every budget? And if it's a 1 year effect, why does it continue the next year?
Well, it's not
I mean, I understand the 1 year hit of we've always had that fake million. I'm sorry, that's a bad word.
But it's
Let me
not
stop
fake. That's what
talking.
I'm saying. Is I think that's, because, well, think about it this way. You have a budget, and like, what budget do you spend down in that? I mean, if it does happen, it's not a great thing. And I think I explained it. If you think about it as a percentage of the budget, it is a very small percentage of, and it's revenues over expenditures that generate it. It's not just one or the other, right? It's revenues over expenditures is where you get your fund balance. It is less than 4% of your budget, right? So, although obviously, because your numbers are fairly tight, it may in and around be the same amount, but for a variety of reasons. But each time, yeah, there are some, it's not like there's some like arbitrary number like stuck into the budget. It may be that, more or less when you're budgeting, if you're always going to be within 3 or 4 or 5% of actual, right? So it's more like how those numbers break each year are different. But as you just get tighter with your tax cap number, tighter with, being a little bit more optimistic in what you're projecting your revenues to be and budgeting at a higher level. I'm budgeting really what the states have been giving to us. I'm not, if any of that money for some reason doesn't come in, we're going to have a shortage of revenues next year, but I'm being more optimistic in my revenues next year. So that number is going to be tighter in out years. I think it's this idea that there's extra money there. I would say it's more, as most people do, you budget your revenues conservatively and your expenditures, you give yourself, you look at different things that could happen. I mean, I can't, I know the reasons why there's that additional money, but again, I have, and it's been good because we've been getting breaks, but I've lived here where we've almost spent down and actually had to like cut spending at the end of the year because we didn't have enough money. So that can happen too. So I do think it's a reflection of things being tighter. I mean, I don't know how else to explain it. And you're not going to be able, I've used this year as an example. If we didn't get that money from the state, this projection will look a lot different. I think it's, there are things that it's most districts do have money. And I said, and if they don't, that
Yep.
maybe they have extra money and they spend it. I mean, we have extra
That's
money,
why,
to try to reserve it.
well, that's why I wanted to see if, and it's late in the game, we're already in April, but is there an item that is, more than a 1-year savings? Is there, are there curriculum choices that we can make that, are there curriculum, and as a math guy, maybe I'll just throw out, IXL seems to be pretty popular. So let me throw it out there so that it's not like I'm kicking something that's not popular. I mean, are these all, hey, Lauren, 1 second, babe. Sorry, that's my daughter, not my co-trustee. Sorry about that. Are there, is there anything out there? I wrote a week ago maybe about, the $1 million bus item, since like you were saying, we don't bus our middle school and high schoolers. How much can we save if we said anybody going to a private school, it's a 7 a.m. departure from the Burke estate, and you're doing like the Ardsley model where multiple school kids get on one bus.
Yeah, but I
And
mean, I'm very familiar with Ardsley, and I didn't know whether that was gonna go up today. So Ardsley, they bus K-12, right? So they have multiple buses out there. They spend a tremendous amount on busing. And what they do is, where they can sometimes bring kids back to a central location, they do our busing for us. And that's something that actually we've suggested as other districts, but the problem is that unless the districts I share the busing with, I don't have enough kids going to the same school. So really, ultimately, it would work. We've looked at it, we've modeled it like central pickup locations. It really only works if we're all, because basically we would be doing it, saving no money, and everybody else in the rest of the quad would not be doing it. So RZ doesn't do it with all their stops because I do have a lot of their routes and many of their students are picked up at their houses too. They do it for some of their out of district bus runs, but not for all. But again, they do have they have K-12 busing, as does Ardsley and Ardsley Irvington. We're like one of the few districts that have a pretty modest busing plan. That being said, there could be opportunities to save the out of district busing. I would say, I think the last time I did the analysis, you could probably save 3, because we do get a lot of aid on those out of district runs. So if we really scaled it back, I think I looked at it to put people on the B line. That was what I was asked the last time. And by doing that, you would save maybe $300,000 in that, because a lot of the children that are special education, that's the larger piece of that, a good piece of that budget is our special education placements. And again, busing is extremely expensive, where we could have a private school student, quite frankly, that could cost us a little bit, but then you could have one on the other end that costs you a lot. Really depends on the placement. Sometimes even some of the closer placements are more expensive, but I have to say expanding the consortium into Edgemont and Mamaroneck has actually saved us a good amount of money. And I think, I'll do whatever the board wants me to do. I mean, I think the one area, yes, if you put them on B-line buses, you would definitely save money. And that would be, I guess, even parentally placed special ed, I think you can put on there, depending if they were able to ride it. So you could consider doing something like that. But again, we are in an agreement with the Quad Village. So when I pull kids off a bus, that increases their cost. So I don't know if we would have to pull out in its entirety. So there's been a lot of talk about this, but I know there's not, currently, the other districts, definitely even last year, they weren't interested in doing it. I mean, and that's something you could ask the trustees in that other districts. That's what when we talk, that's the message I had. So that's what has been prohibiting us from really moving forward, because I also, that in a meaningful way. But that being said, we have extended a bunch of our bus routes this year. And that's why I think in our proposed budget, you'll see we are projecting to get that busing out of district cost lower. We did actually have some additional special ed students that are going to new placements next year. That's why, had that not been the case, that savings would have been greater. What I was suggesting though is I know it was talked about years ago, if you could eliminate the in-district busing, and it would save you like over 3 something. I mean, if you did both together, you could maybe save like 500 if you reduce out of district and then eliminate
Yep.
the district.
No, thank you, Maureen. I'm gonna
That's a
take
big dollar amount to consider. I mean, I know it'd be unpopular and you'd have to consider the traffic, and you get unintended consequences sometimes with that too.
No, I like that. And I'm going to take a pause for a little while on the question, but that's what I want to talk about, some of the unpopular items, and just so we know, what our trade-offs are.
Right.
No busing for hillsides, unpopular. Cutting coaches and clubs would be unpopular. Increasing class sizes are unpopular. Bringing all professional development in-house has consequences. And if there's any other unpopular ones people want to bring up, let's discuss them, because if we're spiraling down, it's time to get unpopular.
Yeah, I think
And
one of the things I think we can, after we're entering a different model with BOCES for our technology, there is an opportunity possibly for an out year to reduce like some staffing in that model. But again, we're entering into kind of a new model, and with all the technology that's here, but that might be an area in which we could save, look for further savings. I didn't include it on this sheet because I think I need to have a little bit of a better understanding of like some of the service model before we like pull it all back with the amount of things we're using. But again, I think this idea of like more of a shared resource there, that's like our ultimate goal. Because technology is something that is becoming more streamlined, and we're hoping to streamline it even more. So that I didn't include that on this sheet, but that is something I've been thinking about, that in the following years, can we get that? Can we get more savings there in terms of like shared resources in terms of our technology? So that's
but like the consortium, you're saying that if we're sending one student to Hackley because we're using Ardsley and Dobbs, and we're not paying for the full cost of that bus.
No, so I didn't, and each year the analysis looks very different, but it, obviously it depends on how many students we have in a bus and how many students, but we're sharing with ours. Right now we have, and depending on the placement, it's on all of our runs, Ardsley, Dobbs, Irvington, Hastings, and Edgemont. We share all of our definitely private school runs. I mean, it's there's times in which a school could be $700 a kid, but then there's a time in the school could be 5,000, because it depends on our placements and theirs, right? But we even have now a shared consortium with Mamaroneck, and we actually share the cost of the oversight of the consortium with them, which has reduced the amount of just like what it takes to run the the busing model. So we really have, busing is extremely expensive, for obvious reasons, right? Like it's a very expensive service. And we're trying to be, try to keep it safe. We want to definitely keep it safe for students. And, I know some parents, like whatever they may need they may need to send a child to a particular school. So we do try to weigh like, how long is it feasible for a child to sit on a bus, with the cost of that. So we have extended some of our routes, but I think we also we do look at each individual route when we make our decisions, because I think everyone would agree, like, is it like, yes, you could do it, but would you recommend putting a child on a bus for 2 hours? Like that just seems like to go to a place that's half hour. Our special ed and our private education students, like many of the schools in White Plains, like Windward is near like Stepanak. So they do ride together. It's not, some of the buses are.
No, sorry, Maureen, I'd like to, just trim this one a little bit, but definitely not thinking about the special ed, kids under 8th grade. I don't want to group that discussion with this. We're not that. This is the These are, you know, our Iona Prep, our Hackleys, our Horace Manns. If there's anything there, I wouldn't want to, you know, as that's something, you know, students that are going to Windward, we have a big commitment to with our SEPTA community and our own community. But if ever we could break it apart, but I don't think it's as big an item for tonight's discussion
That's
unless we
where
can
I
find other
mentioned
things.
it gets tricky sometimes on those routes, because I'm like, if you had a kid that's going to White Plains, if they're going to White Plains, would you take the child off of there like in a given year? Like you probably wouldn't, where, and some of them, Jeremy, they go out and do multiple routes, because when you, each bus contracts you pay for, because of course they can't cover their overhead if they don't do it this way, like a certain amount of hours. So whether you do it, we have buses that sometimes take some of the local kids and come back out and then go over to Connecticut. Like they may do masters, but then they're up in Connecticut, and we're only paying for the cost of those 2 hours, regardless if they just do the masters run. So, I mean, I do think that Ardsley, to their credit, has done it continues to try to make it, they're always looking at ways to make it more efficient. And I think saying to parents, you know, when we do get a lot of complaints when the routes have gotten longer, and I was on the phone with a number of parents this year, but, you know, just trying to say to them, listen, can you just, you know, if we could do this, then maybe we could hold on to the bus. You know what I mean? Like if you can bear the extra 20 minutes or half hour. So it's tricky.
I think it would be important to hear about the notion of staying $165,000 under the max cap, and
Yep.
sort of any potential, you know, the pros and cons of that, and how you sort of came to that. I think that that's an important thing to discuss. And then separately, you know, I know that we're not talking about the federal dollars in this budget, but if you could share, not necessarily this evening, but if you could share with the board the timeline for which, you know, we'll be reviewing what those dollar amounts are, and sort of the process by which the board will provide input for how those will be allocated. I
Sure.
think those are the two main points that I wanted to bring up. And if any trustees who haven't spoken up at this point, I want to make sure that they have an opportunity to ask questions or provide some guidance to this draft.
Do you want me to?
You want Maureen to answer your questions
Yeah.
first, or if I
Yeah,
should?
I think, yeah, if we could just, you could table the idea of the federal dollar.
Okay.
I just want to make sure that at some point gets addressed, whether it's at the closure of this meeting or just in our next board meeting, if we can just have a timetable, and then sort of what the process will be. And then the question that I think for this draft that I just want to make sure we touch on is the idea of staying under the max cap.
Yeah, so basically, you know, the last budget I showed you, and I did kind of show a few different items, and I know we did talk about the pros and cons of either not, we know what the cons are. If you don't go to the max levy, the reason people tend to, or districts, that the thought is to go to the max levy is because then you leave dollars on the table, and then your following year's levy is kind of started at a lower amount. So that is obviously a consideration, and we have at years we have left money on the table. You know, many years we've gone to the max cap. There have been years in which we've left even more dollars than this, and that's always the risk, right? That's the consideration. I think in trying to go back, and I adjusted the aid and, you know, reduce those expenditures and reduce the appropriated fund balance. I think, you know, when I did it, I was almost going to reduce the fund balance further, but I just wanted also the board to have an opportunity. I know you were also looking at what the effective tax rate was for next year. I know the 1% or 1.5% was really that was being discussed was really about the year-over-year growth of the budget. But I thought when I did the removing some things and reducing, you know, taking those reductions from the appropriated fund balance, when I saw the tax rate kind of just at that 1%, I was like, is there a value, again, knowing that next year, I think there was some concern also about the impact of the taxes overall in the village. So I think that was sort of the mindset also. I mean, the 165 would only add, I believe, maybe maybe bring that effective tax rate up to maybe about 1.25 or so, 1.3. But again, that was as kind of close to the 1% mark we could get to. And I figured, you know, I knew we were having this meeting this evening, and I figured, you know, we could talk, you know, debate the pros and cons of that, because really the only adjustment there, if we decided to go to the levy, which again is better long-term, like that 165 would more or less go back to that reserve or fund balance sheet would increase by 165 because we would pull back that fund balance from that appropriation. So it, you know, there's a benefit in the out years, you know, for that. But again, I know in this year we're looking at tax rate, we're looking at all those pieces. So just trying to give an opportunity to say, you know, this would also allow the tax rate to be really just hovering at that 1% mark. So that's why it was presented this evening in that way. So just to kind of consider that.
Thanks, Maureen. Do any trustees have any input that they want to provide regarding that? Are there any thoughts regarding leaving that 165,000 and staying at the tax rate that is being drafted?
I mean, I think it's important, and we can certainly, I'm sorry, not, I know you said the trustees, but I think to Jerry's, so I think it's really looking at those out years and, you know, whether it be in this year's budget, you know, consider some reductions, but I think even, you know, there may be things in those federal dollars that we'll be able to pay for it and be able to either, you know, help us in those out years too. So I think it's, you know, the 165 is certainly important, but I think it's the larger conversation about like how thinking about the out years, you know, what adjustments should we be looking at to tighten things up, I think is probably, this is important, but you know, certainly some of those other ones, because as you see in the out years, you know, the amounts, the 165 will definitely help make that, you know, like ease that gap a bit, but there'll still be a little bit of a gap. So, you know, I'm comfortable to go forth with this tax rate if that was what people felt was better for the community.
I honestly feel sort of torn because I don't know that piercing the tax cap, you know, in a couple years down the line is going to be very appealing either, just given people's property taxes.
Right.
So that makes me think, well, we should go up to what we can.
Right. Yeah. Well, if that's the case, then I would say yes. If we think that we really don't even want to think about that, then we do have to levy to the max each year.
Mm-hmm. And then just following up on what JG was saying earlier, you know, I don't know how it would be to say, you know, to Hillside families, look, we have to try a year without busing to Hillside. We're, you know, it's either that or cut some of our teaching staff really. And we need to try this out if it's, you know, so.
I mean, again, that's just one idea. I was throwing out like large, you know, chunky ideas. Obviously, you know, I'm not suggesting you have to do that because I think it's, you know, it's probably a really large analysis. It could be classed as you look at everything, but I was just throwing out like big, you know, ideas of like large kind of dollar amounts.
That's $300,000 you said, or a little bit more. Yeah. I mean, Hillside's very close to everybody.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean, the one thing and again, I do, you know, appreciate with that is, and because I work with on the flip side, work with the group on the safety committee. And I think that's always, I do understand that sometimes busing in some ways does help alleviate some traffic. I know there's not sidewalks. So again, I would just throw it out there for like, there are districts similar in size to us who have considered it purely for financial reasons, you know, but it is, you know, I think Hastings, like each community, we would of course always do a very thorough analysis before we would even put that out there, because we always want to understand, well, what would that look like if someone had to walk? And we would do that analysis certainly before we would go down that road. But it is a chunk of money, and because we're not required to provide it, it is something that you could consider if it came to that.
I think it would be a huge consideration with a lot of input from people.
Oh, well, you need to get a vote. So the board, just to be clear on that, a change in busing policy requires a referendum.
exactly.
Yeah, so that actually would have to go on the ballot, even if it was being put forth, but something like that, similar to when we looked at the students, even who take out of district busing, we do look at like where they live and like where they would have to walk to, because I think we do know that in certain places it wouldn't be a burden, but in others it could be quite dangerous, you know.
Right, exactly. We have sort of touched on it in the past.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you one in a separate
Sure.
area. What about all the Schedule B appointments? Where do we stand with all of that?
Well, in terms of everything that is being proposed for next year's budget is exactly what it would have been, not necessarily this year, but the previous year, right? Like we're anticipating to run the all the sports and all these, anything that we've had in place, I would say almost like restore to pre 19, I don't even know what 2021 budget level. So, but that again, that's something we've spoken about a lot over the years. Like, should there be, can we look at that more? I think that maybe there's again, I say this just as ideas because there's a lot of ideas and these are just some because you're bringing, but like in Ardsley, they don't have modified sports because then over the course of time, the village has developed a larger program. But again, is that something that could be some conversation starter with, are there other alternatives that we can either look to not maybe fully eliminate, but partner with the village a bit more, even if we were provide them the space, right? Because that's how it works in ours. I'm just throwing out things that other districts have done as you bring up different topics. Similar to like, could the River Arch or somebody, could we partner with them for other things too, right? So I think those are opportunities to look similar, to like, as Jeremy said, you look at ours, like if there is something that even transportation, there was something that could be a little bit more efficient, could that work for us? I mean, I have asked them to look at it, and being they do our transportation, they actually work on our behalf. So for them, so we have kind of looked at that, but I think, look at some other things that districts have found ways.
Right. Okay.
To do it. But I think honestly though, like there, it for us is probably best to look at like taking it, even though it's nice to take it from bigger areas, like as we always try to do, be fair and, do an analysis between taking two big, bites out of things.
Right. So, and the other thing is that we also last year said that we would revisit the FLES classroom situation.
Mhm.
I don't know that we spent any time looking at that.
Well, this year it didn't come up as a budget proposal, but I think part of that, well, for a few reasons. Obviously, up until April 6th, we didn't know what we were getting in terms of state aid, right? So I think, that at that point we were, even though I actually put an increase in state aid, none of us could have, envisioned that we would get this extra money. That being said, even with the extra money we're to receive next year, like Valerie had started the meeting mentioning everyone, and including, I've been on like a million, webinars since that state budget's been released. Everyone is like, be very, very careful. Don't build something that you can't sustain. So I think because the reason I say that about Jody, I think even the FLES this year, people really, I think they really try to prioritize things they felt, although I'm sure that, they would have loved to consider putting FLES or world language. It didn't come up. And I think part of it also is like, people know there's not a lot of money. And I think no one wants to do anything that in a year or two we can't afford. And I think that's like the mindset that all of our building leaders are trying to have in looking at the budget, they're trying to put in, I'm sure there were other things that people wanted to ask for, but they didn't.
Right.
Another way, Jody, to look at the FLES question is, as Maureen said, we have to be careful about unsustainable expenditures. And what some districts, are thinking about, not necessarily as it pertains to FLES, but sort of other ideas which don't involve, a permanent, position, is that some of these funds that are, enrichment funds spent over the course of a couple of years, similar to how the federal funds are allocated and used, are being used for, enrichment programs that can be offered over the summer or after school. So while they may not last, they may not be sort of packed into the child's schedule for the school day, they are enrichment opportunities that can be considered. So that's something to think about as the district is looking at that pot of money. It's not just sort of, I don't want to say closing the gap is not important, but I think districts are looking at the long range of options for young people.
Thank you.
I just a couple of thoughts to share. So Maureen, and I might have missed this. So let's say that we did decide to use, some portion of the 165. I'm assuming we wouldn't change the budget. We would just use less than appropriated and put that in reserves, or that's the kind
Yes,
of thought?
yes, that's exactly what the recommendation would be.
And, I think over the last several years, we've gotten, we've just gotten this mini jackpot with the growth factor, which has allowed us to not, quite frankly, it's allowed us to do stuff we had to do underneath the federal lawsuit
Yep.
and a variety of things. So, which would have led to some really challenging conversations in town, and likely would have precipitated a tax cap piercing at some point in the last few years. I think the bigger, so my personal opinion is I would be, just given the nature of how, there's no reason to believe that growth factor is coming back, right, anytime soon. That was kind of.
No, a lot of it, obviously, we know the majority of well, there's two factors that drove our growth factor, the reassessment, right?
Yeah.
And although initially my understanding was that, 1/3 goes up, down, and 1/3
Right.
would be the same. But what we actually did find is that the actual assessed valuation of the village from the reassessment grew, coupled with the very, expensive property coming online, which single-handedly was a
Right.
large piece of it. So I would say, though, my guess would be no, Doug, unless there could be small tweaks to it, but usually that represents new housing coming online.
I think this is really where the conversations in town have to happen, which is what is the curricular pedagogical focus and level of investment that this town's really up for. And that's a big question. We're all really sensitive to the fact that we have almost zero commercial tax base here. So every single program hits people's wallets directly. We don't have big new properties coming online. We don't have this, we're not going to get the same bump in a reassessment. So we are, I think, moving to, and then COVID throws this crazy monkey wrench into everything and makes a whole bunch of things, challenging, including this kind of the state finances and what's coming from the federal government, how that's going to look. I think we've talked about that with foundation aid and the likelihood that that's going to stick around. I think we've got to bet is no, even if it does come back. And, I don't see a scenario. What I see coming down the pike in a few years is, in a year or two, is, some big investment decisions as to where does this town want to or not want to invest. I can already envision the spirited dialogue at the 25-person, class size conversations once we get there at some point, if we get there. I think if we think about professional development and what Melissa Szymanski just laid out, I think we've got to be really smart about that. There's real value to really smart external consultants. There's also ways to, kind of throw a lot of money at that where you don't get a return. And I think, Melissa and Valerie have been really thoughtful about how we approach that. But we have to keep doing that. And it may be that, as Jeremy Gallen was pointing out, we can invest in some of that. But I really do want to include the town in some of these. These are really big conversations about, strategic direction. It's what Valerie brought up earlier this year and bringing that the idea of strategic planning to the table. It's obviously critical. It's something that has to happen because I think what's happening as board members is we're going and we're talking to our 10 or 15 people that we know, and and we're not having forums where we're really having robust conversations about these things. And we don't really know where the town sits, except for that we know that there's a lot of people who are looking for certain investments and are less tax sensitive. And there's a lot of people who are much more tax sensitive and are looking for decreases or an ability to really keep stasis or somewhere around there of the current. And I don't think we're going to obviously satisfy any of those groups, but we really need to understand some of the nuances here. You know, my sense, what I would be more comfortable doing is levying a bit more and putting some, I don't know if the right number is 165, I don't know. Not putting it in the budget, not to spend, but putting it towards using less of the appropriated fund balance and putting in some of that in reserve. So I would be a fan, and if I were to just throw a number out there, $75,000 to $100,000 of increasing the levy so that we can create a bit more of that cushion and give ourselves more room in, you know, what I believe will invariably be in the coming years if people really want to invest in a lot of these kind of curricular and instructional strategies, will have to be some sort of piercing if that, you know, if it doesn't occur, that we have other ways to get revenue. But I'd like to at least keep that piercing at bay as long as possible. And I think the best way to do that is to, you know, put ourselves in an okay position so we don't have to go for that. What is that, 2/3 vote or 60% vote?
Thank you, Doug. I think that's why I brought up that main question. And, you know, I don't know what the amount is either, but I think, leaving 165 out there just seems, it seems, that more of that should go into the fund balance. I think that, we're acting very conservatively in terms of our expenditures. And I think that it would be a wise decision not to remain that far below the amount still available.
Lauren,
if any other
definitely thank you.
trustees wanna-
Yeah, Lauren, definitely thank you for bringing that up. My number's the full amount. It's 165,000 should be taken out of appropriated and go to the fund balance. I don't quite understand the gamesmanship here. If our fund balance is going down by 2 million to pretend like we're under the tax cap, when Maureen explained it does have a year-over-year effect. You know, it limits us in the future. So it sounds like a one wallet versus the other wallet. We're not under the tax cap at all. You know, we're $2 million over budget if our goal was to maintain a $9 million reserve. So thank you for putting it out there, Lauren. My suggestion or vote, I don't think we're voting. We're definitely not voting. Let me make that clear. Is exactly 165, 157. We hit the full tax cap every year if we are depleting funds, and that's not our goal for being over budget. I thought you brought it up very nicely. Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, I just want to be clear, it wasn't like from a long-term strategy, but I didn't know, like, I know last week we touched upon like just concern about the overall tax rate. And again, it would only give people a very, very small reprieve in a 1 year, but long-term is not something that, I love either. Because it is, like you said, it's not as though we're not using other ways to bring down that tax rate. I mean, it's obvious, right? We're appropriating things. If those weren't there, it'd be different.
Maureen, can you say something? Because, Jeremy just brought up that point around 2 million over, but I remember at the last board meeting, you mentioned something about you get a negative audit if you try to cleave too closely to your exact budget. Can you just say more about that?
Well, I'm saying is like, obviously, if you want to always make sure that you're not cutting all your revenues so close. I think there's just like anything, if you're spending down every dollar of your appropriation, and unable to maintain your 4% fund balance, I think, you can start or not be able to replenish some of your reserves. I think you could, it's actually, would be viewed like you're being, you're cutting like yourself too close to the edge. I mean, obviously auditors, well, obviously the state may feel differently, but in terms of like your financial statement, really, you want to reflect having like some budget savings. And it's also viewed as, they look at it as in terms of like your, how financially you performed year over year. So if you're cutting yourself so close, if you're just looking from an auditing perspective, they would look at like, wow, like you didn't leave yourself any equity in your like operations. So and unable to replenish reserves is looked at negatively. So I think, yeah, there's some schools, I guess, in a situation, if you were just spending it down and able to replenish all your reserves, but then they wouldn't be able to if they were spending all their money. Like my understanding is what was suggested was that the other district spent all their money. They have like your reserves you have to replenish if you have liabilities, and they were like sort of more or less pulling out of them but not replenishing because they ended the year with no money, which I don't know. I mean, I've heard a little bit about that, but I think again, in just because that particular situation was brought up, I know that there was like a negative, issue around that. So I think you do have to be careful just to make sure that both for like, borrowing purposes, you want to make sure you're not, you want to be viewed as having a healthy fund balance at the end of each year, not overspending your budgets, or spending them down to zero. I don't think that that's viewed positively, in terms of audits, because I think they always say, oh, you did good. You had like a 2% more, like, because usually it's maybe 2% on, you may have 2% on expenditures you're under, but it's the fund balance is driven by also the revenue side of it. So usually we're at like 2 or 3% on the actual spending. And we think to bring it to zero is, really cutting it, I think, too close.
Did any other trustees have any input they wanted to provide regarding the levy amount and or any other questions? Because we do need to wrap up this evening's work session.
I'm happy to do whatever. In the Jeremy threw out there 165. I'm happy to do that as well. I'm sensitive this year of some of the optics of that, but look, I think that we have to put ourselves in a position to have, reserves and stave off the piercing as long as possible.
That's kind of how I feel. And then maybe the board needs to talk soon about how we go about having the forums that Doug mentioned, or some sort of way to help people understand the trade-offs. It's either class sizes or it's going to be this or that, to bring them in on those choices. They weren't.
And I do want to, I know I always say this, and it's not to be defensive, but I do think our overall budget, I know it's a lot, but comparatively to districts of our size, we do a good job with the monies we have. I know people may think I see the budget growth and I know people pay a lot of taxes here, but I think you also have to consider, like, we do offer a lot of what other districts are offering. So there's a piece in which you have to decide whether you keep everything that you think is important or you're making reductions, because again, I do always look at other districts that are similar size, and we're not spending as much as other districts that are our size. In terms of, if like Irvington, again, I just use them as a comparison, not so much to say we have to be Irvington, but Irvington is very similar size in their enrollment. They may have maybe 75 more students or 65 more students, and their budget last year, ours was 51,600,000. Theirs was 64,600,000. So I just want to also be clear, like, this idea that like we're going spending every dime and just like there's a piece here that our taxes are very high here. I would argue that our spending compared to comparable districts is not that out of whack. If anything, we're under. Edgemont, again, very similar sized district to Hastings, a little bit larger. $64 million budget. Even Valhalla, which actually has, I think, less students than we do, $56 million budget. So, just to be clear, part of the issue too is like this idea that like there's only so much you can reduce before you start cutting into what makes Hastings. So I think you do have to balance that with the conversation, like Doug said, maybe like Doug said, have community forums, get some, get a lot. We try to engage people with the budget 101, but just really understand what's important to people, and then explain to them what it's going to cost, or else it'll have to come through reductions. But I think this idea that we're out there like wildly spending, and like I even explained our transportation numbers, we spend less than all the quad by a significant amount of transportation, by significant, because we don't offer it to everybody. We have much more tighter busing policies than any other district, except for Pleasantville and things like that, who don't offer in-district busing. I don't think Valhalla does either, quite frankly. But I think we also need to make sure that we're constantly talking about that, not to get the impression that we're at like some out of control spending, because that's just not the case. If we're comparing, again, I know people don't like comparisons, but it's just in terms of, well, like, when people say, oh, you have all this stuff for the sports, oh, Irvington has, yeah, they spend $14 million more than us. Like, there's a point in which like we're trying to have everything. Anytime we suggest reducing something, people don't like that, but then like somehow our budgets are supposed, like the idea that we can kind of continue to spend 51 million and have everything that everybody else has is not, realistic either. So I think it is important to maybe for people to understand that. I think some people may want to pay 0.5% more and not make reductions. I don't know how that works into the conversation too. I don't know if it's only this idea of, because you're going to be paying a lot of money regardless, right? So it's sort of like, do I pay 1.5% more? So I just think in the long-term conversation, I think that's an important part, not to get lost, because that's also an option. I don't know.
Is there any additional feedback trustees want to provide regarding the tax levy, or any last questions regarding the draft budget? Because at this point, a completed draft budget will be provided to us at our next board meeting for voting and adoption to be presented to the public.
Yeah, I'll jump back in, guys. It's feels very late in the game, but we're not. I didn't really like the focus we did on hillside busing and sports without grabbing those other ones that I thought were also unpopular. I would trim. No, not I would. I'm not an administrator. Let me change that. I think there's room to trim development and curriculum before we trim our fund balances. I think the time to do it is every year. But I like the way Maureen phrased it, is it because we've been doing a good job that it's so tough to hold the line? And as you guys know from other conversations, 80% of our budget is benefits and salaries, and those are going up above 2% a year. So interesting way to phrase it, Maureen. We do such a good job that we're only looking at having to see if 60% of our community wants to go with 3% increases, because that's what it feels like. Every time we go down $1 million in the fund balance, that's 2%
Right.
that we kept from the budget. So it's out there. Are we a community that did a good job before and now needs to bust the cap with 3% and 4% raises, or are we a community that has recently tried to make some modifications for special ed that haven't come through yet?
Right.
We've increased some administration. We were smaller in some categories than our peers. So there's a lot of things and I brought up the unpopular, sports and busing, but that's not really the only ones that I would have even in this one. I think once you see fund balances going down, you have to bring PD in-house. Once you see fund balance is going down, you have to ask department heads to do their own curriculum training. And I should drop the word have to. That's not appropriate either. Maureen, my one comment though, do you feel that this budget is another budget that might have $1 million unspent at the end of the year? Because that seems to be 5 years running. Is that a fair number to say? That the last 5 years, there's always been at least 1 million unspent. Do you feel that this is a budget that also has another 1 million that might be appropriated rolling forward, which is friendly and conservative the way it's been out there, or is that not something that's easy to predict?
It looks like we lost Maureen from the call.
A little bit of a brownout here.
Yeah, the rain is starting to come down hard.
But that's probably what happened. Something went out maybe about 30 seconds ago, and my lights went out, but I still
Yeah,
have,
we flickered here.
that's probably what happened.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure I'll have the opportunity to ask her in person as well. So thank you all, guys. Thank
Yeah,
you, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to encourage any trustee who has further questions, that you can certainly reach out to Maureen and Valerie prior to our next board meeting. But I do, I want to thank Maureen, even though she's not on the call, for, the last time we met was Wednesday, which is when those new numbers came out from the state, and it was quite a feat to be productive, and amidst the reopening of all the buildings for all students today, to get a new drafted budget for our work session this evening. So I do want to thank her for that, and Valerie, I hope you'll extend that since she's not on the call.
Absolutely.
We do appreciate that. So certainly if there are any other questions that come up, please, reach out to administrators, prior to our next board meeting, which is next on the 20th. I see Maureen's rejoining us. Maureen, I was just thanking you. I'm sorry you dropped out of the call.
Go down, nothing, did power go off in your office?
Only my lights.
My lights and my computer went down, but then I had to like reboot the whole darn thing.
Oh, goodness. Well, I hope everyone who is not home gets home safely. It's really pouring where I am.
Hope it's not a bad sign for tomorrow.
So I'm sorry, I missed. So the next budget, I think, Jeremy, we hear you, and I guess we could look at that. So are we looking to move this particular, make the changes we discussed tonight on the tax cap and move this forward? But I do think I think with the federal monies, and again, I was just reading through those while different people were talking tonight. I mean, there may be more opportunities to shift some of those items, like PD and things like that, into those grants. But because that's kind of how grants are, things that would be acceptable under them. But I don't know whether we would be able to make those adjustments before the next budget. I think we'd have to kind of move forward with the budget and then look at those things over the next couple of years as those funds are available, see what things we may be able to move. But a little bit off, but I don't know long-term, how, if we remove those, then they're gone.
But over the last 5 years, 5 years in a row, we've had $1 million plus that's been unspent at the end of a year. Do you feel comfortable saying that this budget probably has $1 million in it that's going to be unspent, or did we make adjustments to teacher salary? Did we make adjustments to the line items that we saw were significantly over or conservatively budgeted or overly budgeted? Do you think it's fair to try to guess that, or is that an unfair question?
Well, I think those are tightened up. I think the one thing, and again, just because it is the most challenging for a budget, and this is just as a department, in fairness to them, it's a very difficult budget where we tend to see the biggest I would say, variance in the budget year over year is special education, right? So even last year, we ended up in that, but in terms of the instructional salaries, I know some of them are tighter because some of the people that were on leaves, when people are on leaves and if they don't come back, sometimes we don't know that, or if they go out on a leave. Right now, I think that it's definitely tighter. The only thing that would change that, Jeremy, is if, say, if people were to either take leaves that we anticipated would be here and the replacements were cheaper, then you could have a little bit of a variance. But everyone that I know that is going to return next year or is going to be here next year, you know, that number should be tighter. And I think, I think last year we did have an extra potential section built in that we didn't end up needing. So this year I don't anticipate that because we didn't build in an additional section. So those two factors, a lot of times it's easy. Just to be clear on instructional salaries, I just don't want people to think there's like a wild extra money. I think I one time explained it. If 4 people take a leave of absence next year to say that we don't anticipate, I don't know if, you know, people are going to be here. If 4 of those people are making 120,000 and their replacements are $60,000, that's $240,000. Like, and that actually happens. It's just that you don't know that everyone's plans all the time. So that's just an example of how you could have the variance. But right now, I think it's pretty tight because we have pretty good information on who will be here next year. So I'm hoping there won't be a large change there.
Thanks, Maureen.
Welcome.
Well, thank you, Valerie, Maureen, and thank you, Melissa Delabrera, for arranging the meeting and trustees for attending. And again, the board will be meeting on April 20th. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Oh,
Meeting now?
yeah. Are you going to go?
Yeah.
in one?
Okay. Fair enough.